this is the June 4th meeting of the Jericho Planning Commission. Calling the meeting to order at 7 p.m. First we're going to just review what's on the agenda for tonight. We're going to have public comment, approve the minutes of the last meeting. Then we'll have a guest speaker. David White is going to be talking with us as part of our bylaw modernization grant. We will have a section for public comment related to that presentation. And then we will have reports from various liaison updates and other events. Then we'll have other business, and then we'll wrap up and plan for our June 2024 meetings. So that takes us to item number 3, or item number 2. Are there any adjustments to the agenda that anyone needs to make? No? Okay, so no adjustments to the agenda. So we'll move on to public comment, and that is public comment for items that do not appear on the agenda.
I have no public.
So does anyone online or in the room have comments beyond what is on our agenda for this evening? No? Okay. So that takes us to item 4, approve the minutes of May 21st. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting? Okay, Eric moves. Do I have a second?
I will second.
Chris seconds. Thank you. So all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Heidi's abstaining.
Aye. Heidi is abstaining and Susan says aye. Okay, so that takes us to item 5, which is our discussion of the bylaw modernization grant, specifically focusing on village center zoning districts. And David will take over from here.
And before David starts, I did print out the slides, so if you want a paper copy of the slides to follow along, they're on the table over there by the door.
Very helpful.
All right, here we all are again. Thank you.
It'd be a regular occurrence.
No kidding. I'm gonna be responsible for refreshments at some point. So tonight's presentation is a continuation of the conversation we've had over the last few meetings specific to the various village zoning districts. And I think tonight will be a little quicker because we really covered a lot of the heavy lifting and talking about Riverside and the character-based zoning and issues and ideas around that I think that sets a really good framework for our conversation for tonight, which is focused on the village center zoning in Jericho Corners and Jericho Center. So just to orient people to the 2 areas we're talking about, Jericho Corners being this part of town, where Town Hall is, and Jericho Center being where the green is, and the former Desso's store, for those who know it as such. So I've done a little bit of analysis around the existing conditions, kind of lot conditions, building conditions in each of these areas, and we'll kind of take them one by one. And as part of this conversation, Linda and I wanted to take the opportunity for members of the commission that did some field work to share your observations about these two places. But I'll start here with Jericho Corners, and on the map, depending on how well you can see it, it's pretty bright in here, but is an area in red that is the area that is currently zoned Village Center District. There is a heavy black dashed line, largely focusing on properties along the street, along Route 15. That is the designated village center as part of the state designation programs. And the areas in blue are all areas that are part of the town's water resource overlay district, meaning they're wetlands, wetland buffers, flood hazard areas, sensitive shorelines. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the physical constraints for development around Jericho Corners. It's about 300 parcels stretched along Route 15, but also then heading kind of southeast from there, including the neighborhoods of Griswold and Lafayette and Sunnyview. About 21 of those parcels are less than a quarter of an acre in size, which is what the current minimum lot size is in this district. And 8 parcels in the Lafayette neighborhood off of Lee River Road are less than 0.2 of an acre. Some are smaller, as small as, 0.14 acres. And particularly along Old Pump and Mill Street, where there's some very small lots and historic parcels. The majority of the properties of the 300 parcels are over an acre, and about 100 of them are less than 1/2 of an acre. The narrow parcels that are, as I said, on Old Pump, Mill Street, in some cases in Lafayette, are anywhere between 50 and 75 feet wide, with many others more like 100 to 200 feet in their width, with typical building setbacks of plus or minus 25 to 30 feet. This part of Jericho is characterized by its access to a state highway, but also having public water service and Vermont gas. So it has some infrastructure in place that makes it both suitable and attractive to development of a variety of different kinds. And I'll make note that of the 65 parcels in Sunnyview, 25 of them are less than 1/2 of an acre, and many are 100 to 150 feet in width. So similar widths to along Lafayette. We've had a conversation where Lafayette is kind of highlighted as, we can't do this today. That's a desirable pattern, so it's useful to understand what that pattern is. Yeah, Sabine?
Is everything in red served by the water district, or is it just some of the neighborhoods?
I don't have the water district boundaries on the map. I wouldn't know without looking for sure, but many of them.
A lot of them are, okay.
David, a quick question if I may. You talked about Sunnyview and the high propensity of less than 1/2 acre lots there.
Mhm.
How does that compare to parts of the Griswold? I'm looking at the map sizes, and it just seems like a lot of those initial build outs also have pretty small lot sizes.
Many of them do, particularly if you look at Sunnyview, the properties that are along.
Where
It
you
shows
going?
up here, yeah.
My mouth shows up a little better.
Yeah, much better. Along the southern boundary, those are, of course, all the much smaller lots, and the lots in the middle and on the periphery are a little bit bigger. Those are more like the size of some of the parcels in Griswold. And just to kind of round out the kind of discussion or description of what's here, this map highlights parcels that are largely non-residential in nature. So the large parcel there is a horse farm versus the elementary school, by example. But for a lot of these, as many of you know, there's a restaurant, a convenience store, craft store, a couple of churches, town offices, post office, creamy stand, and the like. So majority of the property in this district is residential in nature, but it is a mixed use district. So it allows for non-residential uses largely anywhere in this district, but if they don't occur, for them to occur on off of a major road, which would, in this case would be Lee River Road and Route 15, it would be a conditional versus a permitted use. So I'm not sure who of the commissioners were.
It was.
That was
Wendy and
Sarah and
Sarah.
me. Yeah, so Sarah and I took a long walk, primarily around we met at the top of Griswold and 15, and then we went down to the mill and then over to Sunnyview and Lafayette and Matt's Meadows and some of the I'm blanking on the other one that's right next to Matt's Meadows and Owen Street and around there. And we were, as we were walking along, we were really looking at, you know, opportunities for infill development, which of course is based on landowner preference and desires, which is, I think it's a little bit harder to get at for planning for growth, because I think that's so dependent on, you know, what one person wants to do with their lot. You know, we were looking at towards the bottom of Lee River Road across from the barn, that kind of area that's a field, like, oh, that we could envision cottage courts there and some other areas that were back behind Matt's Meadows. But you know, really, of course, we're dealing with private landowners, and not probably their desires may be very different than what our visions might be for development there. And then we were also walking around with an eye towards setbacks and how much different a neighborhood would feel depends on like really the road that they're on. Like the setbacks on Lafayette Street felt really kind of warm, and there was a nice community vibe versus the same setbacks as you're walking along Route 15, and it's like just much different. So I mean, that's not like rocket science observation, but it was just sort of a visceral sense that we had. I'm not quite sure what other kinds of things you'd like me to report back on.
But I think it's the highlight of your observations. And of course, in all of this, we're talking about private property where the particular needs and interests and desires of individual property owners are going to dictate what actually happens. The purpose of the zoning is to make things possible, but it's up to the property owner to actually act upon that. So I think, you know, your observations about, you know, where there might be space, should somebody want to do something more or do something different, where there's, you know, a gap in the kind of parade of buildings as you walk down the street, where perhaps another building could fit in very nicely and kind of fill that pattern down the streetscape. You know, are there things you notice about the buildings themselves besides their setback, but you know, their size relative to one another, their side yard setbacks, commercial versus residential?
I know like we keep harping back to Lafayette, but that seems like that was a model that we kept going back to, saying like this feels good. Like all the houses were in relatively the same size. There was a few 2 stories, most were 1 stories, but those that were 2 stories and a bit larger did not feel out of scale. You know, everything sort of felt like it fit. And this, to some degree too, that's the same thing as with on Sunnyview. Sunnyview seemed to have a lot larger lots, and so there was a lot more variety of housing types, but it all fit, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Wendy, I'm curious if you had any observations or take homes from walking on Route 15 in this village center.
Well, I do walk on that kind of regularly, and I don't feel comfortable walking on it. It's not a pleasant experience for me. I think Sarah might have had a different experience, so I don't want to speak for her. but I don't find it pleasant. And I always kind of in my head harp back onto like thinking about how maybe we should do a speed study and petition the town. I don't want to go off on a tangent because I really easily can do that about Route 15, but I do feel like it interrupts.
Anything that you observed about the pattern or the houses or the scale? or the
Uh,
uses?
well, like the pattern of course, those mostly are older houses there, and so they're closer to the road. But it felt as if that would be, it felt totally different for those setbacks on Route 15 than it did on, say, Lafayette and Sunnyview and Griswold. That same distance felt really different to me.
So Wendy, was primarily your discomfort, for lack of a better term, along Route 15 related to the traffic, speed, noise, intensity versus what you experienced from the other side of the street?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like one neighborhood, I felt like, oh, I could hang out here. And the other one, I'm like, I'm just passing through.
I can only
Okay.
speak to when I'm working here on the garden and how noisy and unpleasant it is. Even for the short times that I'm here weeding, I just want to get away because it is really, really loud and awful.
Mhm.
Like there's a bench out there and I say to myself, who would want to sit on that bench? Unless you really needed to sit down,
Right, right.
but it's not a relaxing place.
But Spina, we could also bring up when we walked through
Mhm.
the Riverside area, the Route 15 area,
Was the same, like,
it's just, it
yeah,
wasn't a place you want to hang out.
no.
They utilize their backyards. I know I'm interrupting, but I could see them facing actually away from Route 15 into their backyards and having their communities back there. I don't know if it's true or not, but I have walked back in there and it's kind of sweet, the backyard.
Susan has her hand up. Susan?
Hi, so I was wondering about Matt's Meadow. So that was built after the zoning enabled quarter-acre zoning. But Matt's Meadow, the lots are larger than quarter-acre zoning. And I assume maybe the subdivision tried to stay under Act 250 limits. And I was wondering, like, where Sunnyview and Lafayette built somehow without the constraints of Act 250, because like the zoning is one constraint and Act 250 is a different constraint that the developer or the private property owner needs to manage.
They were, so they predate 250.
Okay.
So it's an important point, Susan, that the thresholds of Act 250 does have an impact on how lots are have been historically created since Act 250 was enacted. And hopefully that will be less or not an issue going forward in these kind of village centers. Any other observations folks want to make about Jericho Corners before I move on to the center? Okay. So Jericho Center. Very different in terms of its size, its access and opportunity. Not on a major state highway. Brown's Trace is a pretty busy local and regional cut through road, but still doesn't see the kind of traffic volumes, good and bad, for development opportunity and potential. It does not have public infrastructure in place. Same features shown on the map here with the historic district / village center designation highlighted in a dark black dashed line in blue wetlands and floodplain illustrating constraints, natural constraints to development. That, and of course, in both of these cases are also steep slopes, but if I were to put those on the map, it would make it just way too busy. So about 45 parcels in this district. A couple of them are less than a quarter of an acre. But most of them are actually over an acre. More than half are more than an acre in size. Smaller lots have between 60 and 80 feet of frontage, where others are more in the 100 to 200 foot range. And again, the typical setback from the street is plus or minus 25 to 30 feet. When it comes to uses, much more residential, but there with a church, with a store, with the green and the library and the community center and the fire station are some non-residential uses here. Who took a walk through here, Chris?
Heidi and I did. We had a very nice tour with Chuck. Thank you, Chuck, for your time and knowledge. Really appreciate it. So among the things that stood out to us, I think it's an interesting example of the historic quality to the development of Jericho. So if you take Brown's Trace through the center of Jericho, when that was first built, it would have been a dirt road for horses.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was never, and the houses would have been, you know, scaled appropriately to the street given that time. And now it's, as Chuck has reminded us often, it's noisy. It's not Route 15 traffic, but it's steady traffic. And we were frequently pausing our conversation because it was loud. And so it's something to bear in mind as we go forward with future zoning, to understand that the historical development patterns don't necessarily translate to current times. Just, you know, from a purely graphic point of view, they don't necessarily correlate. And so what was an historic pattern of setbacks may not make sense today. What was an historic pattern of front porches on the road may not make sense today. And so I think it's important to just bear that in mind. Another interesting thing that Chuck pointed out is that there's a strong neighborhood feeling amongst many of the people who live in Jericho Center, and to the extent that they might be hesitant to do a development project, even if they were legally allowed to, because their neighbors might not like it. And so that's the fact that much of Jericho is owned by, you know, private landowners. This is another variable that comes into play, is that there's a difference between seeing it on paper and seeing what the zoning ordinances are relative to development possibilities, and what the reality is of who owns it, who their neighbors are, and what they may or may not really want to do. And then there's as we've said before, there's a need for septic, but there's also a need for water. And in Jericho Center, I think they almost are, you know, of equal importance in a way. Water to Jericho Center would solve a lot of problems. So that, you know, that's something that stood out. And then we also talked about potential, you know, infill development, and there's a few minor opportunities, and some opportunities may come up as people's personal needs and desires change. But there is a very large potential for a significant development on the land that's owned by the fire station. And would be
that's a really remarkable location, would hold a lot of development, and it would not visually, be in anybody's way. It has a lot of potential, and so it would, as we were talking about it, I thought, boy, the fire department ought to get in touch with a developer and figure out how to make that happen, because it would benefit the fire department, it would benefit the town. And it's a great location. What I'm talking about off of Plains Road. Yeah, I guess,
Wait, off of Plains Road?
Talking about
Or
like
off of Lee
right
River.
here.
Yep.
This-
That's
no, off of Plains.
down lower.
Lee River?
Isn't that plain? This is plain.
Yeah, that's right.
Plains.
Yeah.
Correct, Linda.
This is plains.
So if you turn down to Plains from Brown's Trace, it's on the right.
Yeah. This spot
Yeah,
right
this
here.
Oh, that area. Okay, got it,
It's a, decent sized piece of land.
got it. So you're not talking about the rivers.
I thought the fire department only owns below the fire department.
Well, I'm trusting Chuck because he's the master of
The
Jericho.
north side of Plains Road, they own it all the way down the Lead River.
Yeah.
There's room for 30 or 40 townhouses there, and it's just, it's a crying shame.
That's a
That obvious thing, which.
Great
the select
potential.
board knows about, is not part of the wastewater and water.
and I also, and I don't know that, I don't know if the fire department, it's even on their radar.
Who's radar?
The fire departments to develop that piece of land for. Okay, good. Anyway,
So clearly a key opportunity.
I think it's a key opportunity. A great opportunity in a great location. Yeah.
Other observations about? I can't see.
Yeah,
People-
I'll just add on if I could. Can you hear me? It's Heidi.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that we had some interesting conversation and it really strikes to the questions that we're dealing with, which is what is a mandatory frontage? And setbacks that as we think about zoning, because as Chris said, and it sounds like the others experience too, there is this dynamic between the passing of the cars and the noise and the potential that we would be so-called forcing folks to put their housing or any new housing close to traffic. And so I think that was just one of the tensions that I think we really recognized, is that is there a way for us to encourage additional housing and infill, but not do it in a way that required people to be so close to the road that it was not a pleasant experience for them. And so I think that's a tension that we might want to be thinking about as we think about any zoning changes. Certainly welcoming folks to be close to the road if they want to, but maybe not requiring it in order to do some additional building on lots by allowing, whether it's more houses per lot or allowing smaller lots in certain areas. I do think we really have to wrestle with this question of how to not actually end up creating that opportunity, but in a way that nobody wants it, because nobody wants to be up at the street. And maybe the idea of being up at the street is something that is not based on people's desires and realities, and might be based on an outdated desire for a particular look.
I don't disagree with everything that Heidi and Chris have said about, forcing people to have a certain setback, but to me, what that is an indication that we need to double down on traffic calming. And not, to me, it's not okay to say, well, let's not force people to be close to the road because the road is so noisy, and just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, it's just always gonna be that way, so we have to change. To me, that's giving in to cars. And I'm not willing to die on that hill just yet. So I still think we really, really have to fight harder to do more traffic calming. And, but I agree, we shouldn't if it turns out that we don't wanna have the setbacks so close by mandate, I can live with that, but I don't, it's not an excuse to say the road stays the way it is. Chris?
I agree about the traffic calming need, but in Jericho Center, while we were doing our walk around, I would say that most of the people were in the neighborhood of 25 miles an hour. Some of them, there were a couple of people who were clearly going faster, but most of them were in the neighborhood of 25 miles an hour, and it was still loud. So you can't calm, you can calm, like Route 15 might really benefit from that. Jericho Center, like, I don't know how much more you can calm the traffic without a cert highway.
The issue I have with that, and I agree with you, is that it's not just a question of calming. But you can have calm right here in the corners, and when one of those trucks going out to the landfill comes up the hill, that's probably rattling everybody's kitchen. Where when somebody who wants to show everybody how loud their vehicle is idling down the road, they can be doing 60, they can be doing 10, it's still shaking your house. So it's not just the speed of the vehicles, it's the noise that comes with them. That I think sitting on a porch and having somebody idling a dump truck outside of your house all day, it's not pleasant.
And we have a lot of military units. All out.
Right.
But we need traffic calming,
No,
absolutely.
yeah, it's a Susan has her hand up. Susan?
Hi, in Jericho Center, the trucks are also from the range, so they're really big and loud. But what I was really thinking about was Heidi's comment about frontage. And it's kind of a technical question for Linda and David to think about, where if you, or also what maybe Bill Butler said earlier, where if you orient people a little bit away from the road, but by having the frontage requirement, but then we have driveways, and in Jericho, I think 3 lots can share a driveway. So then there, so you could develop a lot a little bit deeper with a driveway, but I was wondering if we changed, and then more than 3 becomes a road. And I also think people try to avoid making roads because the requirements are much more onerous, and they're required to build these gigantic roads. And if we could allow people to build 4 houses on a driveway or 5 houses on a driveway instead of requiring a road, if that would help take advantage of deepening into the lot and also somehow balancing the frontage requirements.
Yes, I believe it is 3. It's
It
3
is,
lots.
yes, and that's on our radar to think about. Susan, thank you for bringing that up.
Other thoughts before I move along? All right. Thank you for that. That was really good conversation and feedback. So next few slides are similar to what you've seen before. Just looking at what does the ordinance have to say about these places. This is the purpose and description for Jericho Centers. It's very long, or the Village Center District. It's really long, so I've only pulled out those things that pertain most directly to Jericho Corners and Jericho Center. And a couple of things that struck me in reading through this. The part about Jericho Corners really suggests that there are almost 2 districts here. There's one that's mixed use, largely oriented along Route 15, and there's one that's largely residential. And when you look at the use table in particular, where a lot more uses, particularly non-residential uses, are encouraged by being permitted along Route 15, and they're then conditionally permitted in other parts of the district, make me kind of ask the question is, do you really want or expect to have more mixed use development in, like, within Sunnyview and Griswold neighborhoods? Is that an expectation that the town has and wants to encourage? kind of an open question.
By mixed use, though, I'm guessing you're not talking about somebody working from home
No,
or a home.
not at all.
Craft business or.
No, I'm thinking more retail, office, service, hospitality, entertainment.
It's like a neighborhood bar kind of thing. Or a
Yeah, I'm
neighborhood-
trying to think,
Neighborhood rest.
What would
grocery
that
store.
be that, you know, that you would reasonably A, expect and B, want? Or maybe it's vice versa in those residential, those largely single unit residential neighborhoods.
I think the best you could get economically would be someone setting up at a 9 to or a 5 to 7 ice cream shop on weekends. Yeah, the volume isn't enough there to justify much more in terms of business traffic. So I don't,
David, does that include childcare?
I think that, you know, childcare is one of those things that there are different flavors of childcare. At least 2, if not 3 different scales. Home-based childcare clearly fits well into those neighborhoods. There may be a smaller version that's bigger than that could. I guess I just kind of pose that question and reflect back on our conversation about Riverside, where there was a part of Riverside that is very clearly, yes, this is a place that should be mixed use. Should be mixed use everywhere. Not just on Route 15, but in other places. But when we moved outside of that area, particularly along Raceway, it was, yes, still mixed use. So there were some range of non-residential uses that were encouraged and allowed there, but a very different subset. In order to do that, you would need to define geographically what these 2 areas are here, but I just kind of throw that up on the dartboard to see.
I think it would come down to how you define what is the mixed use. If it's an artist who wants to sell something out of their house, of course, that would be probably allowed. If it's someone who's doing hairstyling, low traffic, low volume, doesn't need to draw upon a huge catchment area to be successful. Personally, I don't see that as an opposition to a residential neighborhood.
Mhm.
But if you're going to try and put snowflake chocolate in the middle of Sunnyview, I don't think they'd get the traffic they get now, and they wouldn't be able to survive economically. So
Right.
I don't know whether economics will drive that in and of itself.
It will.
Are you asking about changing the borders somehow? What are you-
I just kind of, it begs the question in terms of, you know, if in parts of this area, there's no reasonable expectation or desire for some of these uses that are permitted. I mean, yes, there is, and we can create and maintain distinctions between these kinds of uses are allowed or permitted on major roads and these aren't or are conditionally permitted. But it just begs the question that maybe these want to be treated differently. And it doesn't have to be a conversation for this round. It could be a future conversation.
Susan, did you still have a question?
I was kind of pondering. It's a tough question. I was thinking about looking to the current mixed uses that are already exist in those areas. Like some people do auto service. Some like Eric was just saying, we have like a jewelry store. We have a skincare store along Route 15, not necessarily in the village center, but a business like that could easily be encouraged to locate in the village center. I think Airbnb is getting more and more common, and you know, whether or not that's like a commercial use or if that's a personal use. I guess it seems like the intensity is a helpful barometer, but it's not been a problem, and I'm hesitant to think about further regulating or restricted restricting uses that are already allowed. Like if we're increasing, potentially, if we're going to enable increasing density is typically associated with residential, but its intensity when you think about it in terms of commercial. So that seems like more like protecting against, or David, you're asking the question, like, if we're going to enable more intensity, do we need to somehow avoid some adverse impacts of that based on the uses?
Yeah, and I'm in this, I'm particularly centered on the intensity, yes, but it's just very different nature of non-residential uses to residential uses. Many of them can coexist very well, others not so much. And I think to Eric's point, ultimately it's the economics that are going to drive where these things are going to go, no matter where you allow them, you know. And so if it's a place that you don't want to go, we sure don't need to, but I just think when we look at those, the way the ordinance treats this particular village center is that it kind of, there are two parts of it. All right, so you've seen this slide before. This is again just highlighting what are the dimensional standards in the village center district. I'm not going to spend any time with this, but you can see how it compares with the target, and in particular in this case with what the PUD standards are, and that the current is a pretty sharp departure from that compact development objectives. The intensity limits, again, similar, and I raised this issue last time that it's a little misleading that multi-unit housing can reasonably occur in these places given the density limits. PUD allows for some flexibility in the lot size and in setbacks, as well as for allowing for more than one principal use on a lot. But if those opportunities can be built directly into the district standards themselves, then you can alleviate somebody from having to go through the process and the discretionary process of PUD review before the DRB, which can help facilitate new development.
Did
And
everyone see Heidi's question or comment? It was in the chat.
No,
It was. Heidi, can you just say your question again?
Oh, sure. I'm not sure if I was following fully the concern that was raised about density and limiting uses or not in parts of the neighborhood, but I thought that there was, as Susan was speaking, I thought, is there a way of qualifying what would fit? But I see you have this other list. Sorry. What I was thinking is, like, could we qualify it in a way that said it was home-based or less than a certain number of employees so that it had a better mix? But I am now looking at David's slide and not sure that I need to keep mine going.
so Heidi, yes, you can indeed continue or add to those qualifiers for different kinds of uses, limiting their scale, limiting their location. I tend to look at zoning ordinances and trying to ensure that the ordinance says exactly what you really want to have happen, not suggesting some things that are just unrealistic to happen. So, you know, even allowing for a lumber yard or a garden center as a conditional use in what is and will always be and is always desired to be a largely, you know, residential neighborhood, is a little disingenuous to me. You know, you ought to just say what you mean, rather than expect, probably so, likely so, that the economics will take care of it. That doesn't always hold true. But I thought it was worth at least raising that question.
No, and
And-
I appreciate it, David. I think part of what I'm recognizing is we don't update the zoning all that often. And can I predict what all the potential uses are going to be down the line to say yes, this, not that? So trying to think of whether there were certain principles that we could apply in addition to the naming the particular, because it's who knows what it's going to look like in 10, 20 years, right? And we might not get back to a new zoning change.
Yes, indeed, and particularly when we, shift our conversation to talk about uses, that's something that is really important to be thinking about, that, the level of specificity that is often found in a use table makes it difficult to accommodate new types of business, particularly business activities, as they change and evolve. So trying to think about what are the commonalities of these types of uses, that they share, grouping them together and regulating them accordingly based on those basic characteristics.
Susan.
Okay. But we do know that Jericho's place in the region, in the county, is to provide housing primarily, and the businesses that should be located in Jericho in general, not exclusively, but in general, are ones that service residents of the local area. Our role is not to be like an employment center or a big, commercial growth area. So when I think about uses, David, you said earlier about, what can coexist and what would be compatible with housing. So we would want to be careful, I think, about uses that would make current housing or future housing or renovation of future housing not attractive. So that's a comment there. And then in terms of this particular chart that you're displaying, when you talk about less than 3,000 square feet, that is a useful kind of threshold, because that indicates a little bit of like, the size of the structure, the size of the business. But if you think about Palmer Maple is probably less than 3,000 feet. I don't know, but it has a huge impact because of the traffic and the parking. So I almost wonder if the less than 3,000 square feet is almost too blunt or not necessarily serving the purpose, and that if to think about what are actually the impacts of a use that would be adverse to surrounding residential uses. And it might not be just the size of the building. It might be more about parking and traffic and noise and operation and coming and going.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. Operations and parking. So you've seen this use table before, and as I said, allowing for 2 to 5 or more residential units, even as a conditional use, is highly unlikely given the density limits in this district. So that's something that we'll be taking a close look at. So now I'm going to kind of turn.
Before we
Yeah,
move on
go
to
ahead.
that, on the commercial and industrial uses, I'd like to see something that makes it possible for technology changes to allow what would in the past have been considered a heavy industrial use to become a minor use. I'm thinking specifically, say, of additive printing and the ability you might have with that to provide pots and pans for the entire neighborhood. on a one-off basis through a low cost, rather than relying on large distribution chains and foreign manufacturers and so on. If you go back 100 years, 120 years, Jericho had a blacksmith. Jericho had a wheelwright. Jericho had wagon manufacturers. And everything that we needed was made local. But to say today we don't want that because the current technology is not quite there, but additive printing is getting very close to that level. And I would hate to see us saying, oh, sorry, you cannot be a manufacturer of cutlery because it's metalworking. We don't want metalworking here, when it's done through a completely different technology. So that's something that when I see this light manufacturing and all that condition, I think we might want to just tweak it a little bit to allow for technology.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, that when it comes to manufacturing, back to your point about economics, I'm going to date myself. The Jolly Green Giant is not going to, establish a canning factory in Jericho, Vermont. No, they're just not gonna. So you don't need to say, ooh, can't do that, because you eliminate perhaps a whole bunch of other opportunities, and particularly smaller in scale, smaller in impact. The kinds of tools and technologies that are being used are something important to be
I
flexible.
mean, it was blame it on Oliver, the sauce manufacturer that was living for a while.
Arthur.
Blame it on Arthur.
It's Arthur's fault.
It's Arthur's
That's-
fault.
That's the kind of thing we want here.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Right. We want businesses like that to be able to move out of their household kitchen into another space. So accounting for those kinds of things is very,
Heidi,
Yeah, thank you. I just realized I don't know what home occupation is, apparently, because it says permitted conditional. Can you just speak to that one item, David?
So off the top of my head, I don't have the details in my head, but generally, home occupations are regulated in two forms. The permitted form has no outside employees. So it's you and I working as, consultants from our living room, as a home occupation, that type of thing. When you introduce a limited number of outside employees, and I think there are probably a couple of other triggers, it can be allowed as a home occupation as a conditional use. Is the way the current language reads.
Thank you. That was sort of the idea that I was mulling on earlier, and that's how it's framed. Thanks so much for explaining.
Yep, absolutely.
But would that also include if I want to be a gunsmith? Would that be, I can do it as long as I'm my own employer, would that come into different regulations? I'm picking gunsmith because it's deliberately provocative.
Yeah,
It also exists in Europe.
I would have to look to see, does it say anything that would trigger that differently? But on its face, I'd say, yeah. If you're a gunsmith, you make guitars, you're a woodworker, there's lots of things that at a bigger scale, wouldn't be appropriate, but why not? Because I think about this in the context of, there are a lot of people with a lot of interesting hobbies, and they do the same thing just for their own personal enjoyment versus as a side or primary hustle. What's the difference? Why do you treat them differently?
Leave them alone. Let them do it.
All
I
right,
have the definition here. I can speak to.
so would a gunsmith be allowed?
Well, it does say that you can, well, I'll just read the definition. Any use conducted entirely within a dwelling or an accessory structure that is clearly incidental and secondary to the use of the dwelling purposes, in which does not change the character thereof, and in connection with which there is no outside display or storage, nor emission of dust, noise, fumes, vibration, or smoke beyond the lot line. There's a little bit more, but
Mhm.
It's pretty good.
those conditions of dust, smoke, fumes.
Yeah,
might
and
come into
particularly
play.
beyond the lot line, the thinking about those kinds of nuisance externalities that are kind of beyond the traditional scope and expectation of a residential area. You know, people's lawnmowers make
Dust,
noise,
smoke, noise from cars.
you know?
Well, that's car repair shop.
Right, right. All right, I'm gonna keep moving. So just kind of changing directions a little bit more and thinking about rewriting the description in the ordinance to be shorter, more succinct, and should there need to be a distinction, and I'm not saying that there does or does not. I think this will play out when we start talking about uses more between Jericho Corners and Jericho Center, then we would describe them a little bit differently. But thinking of these two village centers, either independently of one another or collectively as Jericho Village Centers District, different from Riverside, it's a different animal. Where we're gonna make do our best to maintain these as mixed-use district, as a mixed-use district with a variety of non-residential uses permitted. You know, keeping with what the current use allowances are, to the extent practical. And allowing for a compact development pattern similar to what exists and what is found in what we talked about for Riverside. This part of the character-based zoning in terms of you don't have to build a narrower lot. You don't have to build close to the street, but you can if you want to. So there is a range of minimum and maximums, particularly around lot width, front yard setback, kinds of things. Looking for opportunities to enable more than one principal use and principal building on a single lot so that PUD really is not necessary here. I really don't think most new development or any new development other than something of a much larger scale and impact needs to go through a conditional use or a PUD process. They should just be able to happen if you've defined your standards correctly. And kind of getting back to, if there's a distinction between Jericho Corners and Jericho Center, it's largely going to be based on uses, because when we look at just the pattern of existing development, the lot shapes, their orientations, the building shapes and sizes and orientations, it's all pretty similar. It's not a big difference between Riverside, Jericho Center, Jericho Corners. But it's the kinds of uses that are there and that you want as a community to be there that is ultimately going to be different. So with that, we've really completed our review and analysis of the existing conditions for the village center districts, including the character-based zone. And we're going to be moving on to specifically focused on uses and revisions to the use table, revisions to site plan review standards that make at least the language in the ordinance generic for those site plan review standards as to who's responsible for conducting the review. That doesn't reference the DRB or the zoning administrator. It's agnostic. And then you can say, in these certain situations or in these particular locations, who conducts the site plan review. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. The revised architectural design standards for Riverside is something that is going to go through a bigger overhaul, and I hope to share those with Chris in advance to kind of get your feedback after we've taken our first tear at it.
I was going to share some with you. So
well, perfect. If you want to start that, but you know,
Happy
we'll
to,
definitely
yeah.
circle back
Okay.
before we come back to the full commission. So I'm going to come back to use table because Linda and I have talked about an exercise or a way to try to engage the commission in reviewing what currently is provided for in the use table for these areas. And one thing I would particularly stress about that for you to think about is what might be missing. And, I think I would encourage you to be, fairly far ranging in terms of the kinds of things that might be missing. And then we can, if those are things that make a lot of sense to everyone, we can work at how we massage it into kind of fitting within more generic categories. But I'd rather start with more and pare that down rather than less. Well, Linda, do you want to?
Yeah, so we thought as an activity for planning commissioners before the next meeting, if you would all be willing to take on a task, would be to review the use table that David and I will provide to you, that has the existing standards for each zoning district. And then a column for proposed standards where David and I will populate it with our recommendations. In a lot of cases, it will be the same. In a few cases, it will be different. And reviewing that for the village that you did your ground truthing homework on. So going down the whole table, and either verifying that what we have is correct, or what David and I have proposed seems reasonable, or highlighting things that seem questionable, coming up with things that might be missing. There are a few things that we'll be putting on there that we've heard from stakeholder feedback that are missing, that we're going to propose to include. So that's sort of like the homework task that David and I thought might be interesting work for all of you. What do you think?
Yep.
Sounds fine.
Yep.
Sound good?
Mhm.
Great.
Cool.
So David and I have to finish our draft version of the table, before we send it out. Do you think we could probably get that in the next day or two?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll finish our draft version in the next couple of days and send it out to all of you by email.
By the weekend. Yep.
Yeah, by the weekend. And then if you folks could get together with your partner that you did the ground truthing work with to go through, or do it on email or however you want to do it, and get your feedback to David and I. Will send it to me. Do you need it well ahead of the next meeting, or would it?
I wouldn't say well ahead. We should talk about how to facilitate the best kind of format for that
Okay,
feedback, but the intent is for it to be the bulk of our conversation at the next meeting on the 18th.
yeah. So when we send out the draft table, we'll give you a deadline
Yeah.
associated with it.
When you send out the draft table, are you going to send it as something brand new or as a red line of the existing table?
It will look more like a red line where you will see, it'll be obvious to you what's being proposed that's different from what the current ordinance provides for.
Great. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, if I heard you correctly, it's a column A, column B, old, new, and we go through and look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay. That's all I have.
Easy, yeah. Okay,
And just to be clear, it's for all three village areas. It includes Riverside
yes.
as well. Because I think it's useful to think of these three places in their kind of variations in kind of scale of opportunity to think how they relate to one another. Well, geez, if we're going to allow this to happen here, why don't we allow it to happen there, or vice versa?
Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and so this might be a real, what's the word? Okay, it might throw us in a different direction, but I am reminded, David, of when we were doing the town plan update, and we had the notion of the golden triangle, right? And connectivity between the different areas. And once upon a time, there was an idea of like, oh, what if we just change the zoning for all of that to allow greater density of housing, right? By reducing their lot requirement sizes. I understand that that may or may not be part of what the responsibility is in terms of the work that we're doing under the contract that we have with you and the grant that we have with the state, but I'm wondering how we hold that potential and idea active in the work that we're doing now, focusing on these three centers. Sort of like as you were saying, like what we're hoping to do is look across the three and make sure that we're learning together. And what I'm wondering is there a way for us to also carry the longer term question and or vision that I think some of us had of the Golden Triangle, where, you know, there was this opportunity for increasing residential density and opportunity throughout that whole connective area.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Heidi, and the focal point here for us is really the 3 points of that triangle. And then the subsequent conversation, once you've kind of defined, you know, what the nature of those 3 points are, is then what happens either in the middle of all of that, or at least along the three legs. That's because you're dealing then with some other zoning districts that aren't the mixed use centers. There's at least a couple of different conversations around the low density residential district, the ag district, and particularly the commercial district that kind of need to be had once you're done talking about the village centers. But I think you need to get the points nailed first, but appreciating that they are the, you know, they're the focal points for what that what defines that triangle.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for helping me understand some of the sort of the theory behind it, as well as the sequencing that we're imagining in order to get there. I'm just I appreciate that we have this opportunity for such intensive conversation and discussion and work together. And as we know, there are some things that move more quickly than others. And I don't want to lose the whole that we're looking for because we're stuck in the weeds, right? But I know the weeds are also very important. So just trying to balance that.
Yeah.
Heidi, I would also add that I would encourage you to think about this work as the first step in a process of looking at the whole triangle.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda.
Yep. Okay, that's what I have.
Okay. So that closes out item number 5 on the agenda and puts us to item 6, which is public comment related to David's presentation. So is there anybody? Okay, Chuck. And we are limiting comments to 3 minutes each.
First time around.
You want me to run the timer?
Sure.
I want to thank the three groups for visiting the village centers. I feel like this conversation has been the closest one there has been on the reality and the actual potential of infill in the village centers. You know, I'm an advocate of infill, but I'm quite skeptical of the degree to which the town plan and the planning commission, the select board are relying on infill to address what we have described as a housing crisis. And I really appreciate Heidi's, you know, recent words. I mean, 7% of town is in the village centers. 7% of town, another 7% is in the village areas where we have a whole lot of houses on half an acre in an area with 1 acre zoning. I mean, it just seems pretty obvious that we need to go to quarter acre zoning in those areas, or 8 acre or something. I mean, we are responding to a crisis at, glacial speed. We're gonna have a conversation about this, and we're gonna have a conversation about this. We are quickly moving through the 8-year term. I just and I just point out that the bulk of new housing at a reasonable price is going to come in big chunks with manufacturing efficiencies. And I look at Starboard Road, there are more houses on Starboard Road on a third of the land of compared to Jericho Center. That we need to be finding spaces of land where we can put a bunch of houses. And I think this more realistic view that's developing, I think, on the potential of infill means we really need to move rapidly in terms of expanding the village centers. In terms of the roads, I did some arithmetic using state data, and more than 60% of Jericho Center's road frontage is on Brown's Trace, and a hunk of the remainder is on Tillotson Drive, which has an HOA, which forbids infill development, and 60% of the road frontage in Riverside is on Route 15 in Pleasant Valley. So this relationship with the road is really important. The houses on Jericho Center are not 20 to 30 feet from Brown's Trace. Most of them are more than that. I live 40 feet from the road, and it's miserable. I think in terms of mixed use, I mean, Jericho has a horrible record on home occupations. I mean, there was a poor woman on Plains Road that had to go to the then equivalent of the DRB in order to get permission to spin yarn in her house. It's currently zoning bans making things with hand tools in parts, in parts of Jericho. So I think trying to nail down like what is a home occupation, I think we should be focusing on things like noise and the things that we really care about, being able to be flexible about whatever the occupations are of the future. I mean, the real issue is it noisy? Or is it, does it create dust, or does it create a nuisance?
So that was 3 minutes. If you could just wrap up your sentence, please. Thank
Sure.
you.
I think the last thing is I hope that you will also eliminate things that make infill more costly. One of them is the requirement to bury power lines. I mean, it's really ridiculous. The power lines cross the road in Jericho Center 25 times. There's 50 houses, half on the side of the telephone poles, half on the other side. I was forced to bury a power line. I don't think anybody is happier being in Jericho Center because there's the power lines cross 25 times instead of 26 times. It is strictly an extremely expensive aesthetic issue. It has no impact on the reliance of the grid. And a line from the telephone pole to a house is one line and one house. If that fails, it doesn't have any impact on the grid. So if you're going to require things like that, you really have to understand what the costs are and decide if you're willing to make infill that much more expensive. Thank you. And thank you so much for your visits to Village Center. We welcome your visits. Hope you spend more time there. And
Thank you. Anyone else have a comment online? We don't, anyone in the public from online have a comment or question? No.
I could say one thing. I'm
Well,
very
you
impressed with
if you want to say something, you
Come
have
up to
to
the
come
mic.
up to the chair.
Well, it's just a comment.
Well, you still have to come up.
All right. Bill Butler, I'm just saying, thank you very much for taking this so seriously. It's such a serious issue. And everybody in town is, I think, paying attention, or a lot of people are. And I really appreciate you're really honing in on the subject. Thank you so much. That's it.
Okay, no further comments, so we will, oh, did you have one, Michael?
I'm
No,
fine,
okay,
thank you.
all right.
I submitted some comments and I want people to have a chance to look at them and.
Yes, I
if there's
saw
any
that you
occasion
sent
to
an
talk
email.
about it, that'd be
Very
great.
interesting.
Thank you for the email.
Oh, yes. I did want to make sure you received them. So
Yes,
that's
yes,
the
thank you.
main question.
Okay, are we good? All right, so that brings us to item 7, liaison updates. any takeaways from recent events, seminars, or upcoming events? Anybody online have anything to report or upcoming?
I'll just offer that at a recent select board meeting, the select board decided that they would like to hold a retreat of sorts, a meeting, so that they could discuss some topics that they feel like they normally don't have time for during their regularly scheduled meetings. It will be sometime in June. It will be a publicly warned meeting. They're working on the agenda for it, last I heard. But capital budget planning and the town plan and the goals of the town plan were some of the topics that they are considering to discuss. So I thought planning commission people would be happy to hear that, and I thought it would be a really productive discussion for them to have.
Anything from you, Wendy?
No, I'm all set.
Okay. You guys, anything? The only thing I would add is that I attended the conference for the urban and community forestry group, and they gave a lot of information about the community tree planting grant that's available through CCRCP, or they're managing the grant. So I am going to work with the Conservation Commission and the tree warden to see if we can apply to that grant to get some additional street trees in town. And also spoke with Linda and Susan about the potential for adding street trees in the new section of sidewalk in Riverside. That there is a way to do that with V-Trans, actually. So something to think about for the future, because I think that would enhance the neighborhood feel, and trees are one of the things that are listed a lot of times as sort of traffic calming elements. So it would be nice. It would be good.
Can I just make my usual request?
Yes, I know, short ones.
Grab apples, trees that don't grow more than 20 feet tall, so we don't lose the view of Mansfield.
Lose the view of Mount Mansfield from that section of Route 15.
Depends on where you're looking at it from.
I don't think so.
Yeah, if I could
But-
jump in, this is Heidi. I am
Yeah.
all for street trees, both for traffic calming, but also climate change. They're
Mhm.
really, really important. Keeping a tree canopy, particularly in neighborhoods, is going to be important for reducing heat and providing shade for people, which is a major public health issue. So I am all for anything that allows us to add more trees into
too.
residential and commercial areas.
Great. Yes, that's a good point. Thank you. That's all I have. So we are up to other business. Any other business? Did you read them?
Nope.
Okay, that brings us to item 9. Wrap up and planning for our next 2 meetings, which are on June 18th and July 2nd.
So the June 18th meeting, is gonna cover, David's gonna be here again and cover the topics that he showed on his last slide, including the use table, talking about architectural standards, and that will be our last meeting with him before he starts assimilating all of the information that we've discussed into the red line version of the zoning update. I take that back. He'll be giving us a preview of the summary of changes in July. And then in August will be he'll be delivering the red line. So we'll have one other opportunity, but the June 18th meeting is really sort of like the place where we should give him all the feedback that he needs to start working on it.
And that's the revised architectural design.
We're gonna be discussing that at the June 18th meeting.
Yes.
Yep. And then on July 2nd, let's see, I have on here possibility of inviting Affordable Housing Committee to give feedback on the zoning updates. And that was the only item I had for that meeting, and I wanted to just confirm with folks here that you want to have that meeting as it's close to the 4th of July holiday and that people will be around and available. If you don't know right now,
July 22nd.
No, July 2nd.
July 2nd. Yeah, if you don't know right now, that's okay. We don't have to make a decision, but think
be
about
here.
I'll be here.
it. Okay. So if you
I'll
have
be
any, okay, great. If you have any other items that you want to add to that agenda, you can let me know.
I just have I have a question. So, do we have a plan mapped out for the planning commission for our focus for the calendar year? I mean, you probably have a sense of that, but I'm just thinking of other potential zoning changes we might want to think about while we're sort of focused on this bylaw modernization thing, that there might be other things we want to be doing sort of simultaneously.
Like after this is kind of wrapped up and,
Yeah, like last year, I mean, most of last year was spent on the town plan.
Yeah.
And so, I feel like there's a number of other areas we could be pursuing, and so I just wondered how you're planning that out, I guess.
yeah, I can take a look at that and see what we could maybe fit in. Because another item that had come up was a joint meeting with the Energy Task Force. So I can touch base with Susan to see if that seems ready to happen or we need
Okay.
more planning, but yeah, we can, and I can revisit the town plan stuff too.
And like, I guess this goes to Heidi's point and Chuck's point, but there's probably zoning changes we could make outside of the village centers that would be
Mhm.
beneficial, that we could be moving along. I guess.
Okay.
And Linda, can you be sure that on that plan, on that timeline, we've noted when the planning commission, as if appropriate, talks about the capital budget things, because we missed that window last year. We just want to make sure that we're planning ahead sufficiently this coming year. Thank you.
Dare we bring up the official map? Other topic to be looking at.
Yep, that's on my list. For after this zoning update. Okay.
And is there time at which, I know Susan, you have taken on the liaison with the Trails Committee and their new mandate. I'm just trying to think of Eric's note of the official map led me to think about whether or not there's any more proactive work that we can support with the Trails Committee in the thought that they might be doing a map.
Yeah. So Sabina actually has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting with that committee, but Sabina and I presented to them at their last meeting about the town plan, and we explained to them that the official map is like the next project in our queue, and we will be relying on them to contribute their ideas and requests and for connectivity. And so we left them with a little bit of homework of like, there's a section of our website, the Joint Jericho website, that describes what an official map is, because they don't even know what it is. So we gave them like the 101 on official map. And we asked them to look at their 2015 bike ped plan, which was developed before any of them were on the committee. So they don't even really have their minds around the existing plan, which names like desired connections. So I guess the answer to your question, Heidi, is yes, you're right. Yes, we kind of teed it up. And yes, we need to be working with them through the summer so that by the time the planning commission schedule is ready to start working on the official map, that they've sort of done their work and they can come into that discussion, not starting at ground zero. So Sabina and I will continue to work with them through the summer on that.
Thank you. That's a big lift and that's awesome.
Yep. Sure.
Well, I have a question related to that, which is probably, I don't know if it's the right time for it, but would any of the information we're getting about the wastewater feasibility study mapping be something that would be incorporated into an official map?
Yep.
We map out the sewer lines, the locations, does it all have to be in the official map?
Well, I guess I was thinking not just of existing, but of
Future.
opportunities.
Is the select board just talking about that on Thursday, do you know?
Yes, John Ashley, the engineer who did the village center meetings about the wastewater study, is going to be presenting to the select board this week on Thursday.
Is that the same presentation we've all heard? Or condensed version?
It's a condensed version with a summary of the feedback from those meetings, is my understanding.
And is he making a recommendation? to them?
No, not at this time.
It's only 60%, no recommendations yet.
No, but I thought he said at those meetings that he was gonna anyway, so the answer is no. Okay, so, I believe that brings us to item 10. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Chris,
Adjourn.
do I have a second?
Second.
Eric seconds. All in favor of adjourning the meeting? Say
Bye.
Hi.
Bye.
Thank you all. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank
Thanks.
you.